My name is Leo Miller. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my professional life, I've worked in operations and systems strategy inside fast-growing tech companies. The kind of role where, if everything runs smoothly, no one notices you. And if something breaks, suddenly everyone knows your name. People usually saw me as steady, quiet, reliable. The guy who didn't need recognition. I wasn't the loudest voice in meetings. I didn't dominate Slack channels or chase credit. I listened more than I spoke. I documented more than I advertised. And for a long time, I thought that was enough. But here's what I learned. When you're calm, people assume you're passive. When you're patient, they assume you'll tolerate anything. When you don't fight for the spotlight, they assume you don't mind standing in the dark. This isn't a story about revenge. There was no dramatic shouting match, no grand speech, no explosive email sent at midnight. It's about something much quieter. It's about the day my team was told to stop talking to me or lose their jobs, and how I watched them avoid eye contact, afraid to check messages or even say hello. I want to be honest about what that felt like. The confusion, the disbelief, the slow realization that something systematic was happening behind closed doors. I won't exaggerate what happened, and I won't pretend I handled it perfectly. This is a story about power, not the loud kind, the structural kind, the kind that operates in silence, the kind that isolates you without ever raising its voice. But it's also about self-respect, about the moment you realize that being underestimated is not a weakness, it's leverage. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how it started, how it escalated, and what I chose to do when I understood the full picture. There were choices, more than one path forward, and not all of them were clean. What I can promise is this: I didn't destroy anyone. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't break the law or cross a moral line, but I did change everything. If you've ever felt slowly edged out of a room you helped build, if you've ever watched people shrink away from you out of fear that wasn't yours, you might recognize some of this. Have you ever been treated like a problem simply because you refused to become one? Before everything shifted, I was the steady one. In a company obsessed with speed, I was the person who slowed things down just enough to keep them from collapsing. I built process maps when everyone else built pitch decks. I created documentation no one read until they needed it. I asked quiet questions in meetings that sounded small but prevented expensive mistakes. To leadership, I was reliable. To my team, I was solid. To new hires, I was the calm one. And in a culture that celebrated visibility, I was almost invisible. I wasn't excluded. I wasn't mistreated, not at first. But I also wasn't fully seen. When quarterly wins were announced, the spotlight naturally drifted towards sales or product. When systems didn't break, no one thought about operations. Stability doesn't photograph well. I remember one town hall where the CEO praised our fearless innovators. The room applauded. I clapped too. I had stayed up 3 nights that quarter, preventing a compliance failure that would have cost us millions. No one knew. That was the point. Quiet prevention rarely becomes a headline.
And it got to be a buy it tamam omens.
I told myself I preferred it that way. The truth is, I had learned early in my career that visibility can be dangerous. At 27, I'd trusted a senior mentor with a strategy document I built from scratch. 2 weeks later, he presented it as his own. I confronted him, calmly, and he smiled in a way that taught me something permanent. From then on, I decided I would build value that didn't require applause. Systems don't need applause. They need accuracy. So I became precise. I tracked everything. I archived conversations. I saved versions. I kept my black notebook close. Dates, decisions, deviations. Not because I expected conflict, but because clarity matters. My team respected me. Not in a charismatic way, in a steady way. They came to me when something didn't add up. They knew I wouldn't overreact. I wouldn't throw them under a bus to protect myself. I protected the system, and by extension, them. But here's the subtle part. When you become the dependable infrastructure, people stop thinking of you as a person with leverage. They start thinking of you as a function, a background process, something that simply runs. I noticed small shifts over time. Leadership meetings I used to attend started happening without me, framed as product-focused discussions. Strategic conversations became summarized for me afterward, not shaped with me inside them. No one was hostile. They were comfortable assuming I would adapt, comfortable assuming I would absorb change, comfortable assuming I wouldn't push back. In performance reviews, I was described as extremely valuable, though less externally visible. That phrase lingered longer than it should have. Less externally visible. In other words, less politically relevant. I didn't feel anger. Not then. What I felt was something quieter. A slow awareness that I was being positioned in a very specific role. Reliable, useful, contained, signed. The man who makes things work, but doesn't steer where they go. And because nothing was openly wrong, I had no reason to object. After all, I was still respected, still employed, still included, technically. It's strange how invisibility can feel like stability, until you realize it's also insulation, and insulation can be removed. At that point in my story, I didn't know that insulation was already thinning. I didn't know decisions were being made that would redefine my place entirely. I only knew that the room felt slightly smaller, and that people had started speaking just a little more carefully around me. Subtle, almost imperceptible. But I noticed. I always notice. The first cut didn't draw blood. That's why no one else saw it. It happened on a Tuesday morning during a cross-functional sync, the kind of meeting that usually felt procedural. Product, sales, operations. 45 minutes, clean agenda, predictable tension. I had flagged a risk the week before. A compliance issue was tied to how customer data was being routed through a new feature release. It wasn't dramatic, just structural. The kind of thing that becomes expensive 6 months later. I laid it out calmly. 3 slides. Clear documentation. A suggested adjustment that would delay rollout by 2 weeks. The head of product, Aaron, leaned back in his chair and gave a polite smile. "Leo," he said, "I think we're over-optimizing for edge cases. We can't let operations slow innovation every time there's a hypothetical risk." There it was. Light. Almost casual. Operations are slowing innovation. I didn't react. I clarified the potential regulatory exposure. I referenced the specific clause. I offered to take full responsibility for mitigation if we moved forward. Aaron nodded, still smiling. "Noted, but we're going to move ahead. Let's not create unnecessary friction." The meeting moved on. No one challenged him. No one defended the concern. The CEO shifted to timeline projections as if nothing meaningful had just occurred. On the surface, it was a simple disagreement. But what stayed with me wasn't the decision. It was the framing. Not "we disagree," not "let's revisit this." It was "you are the friction." When the meeting ended, 2 team members lingered behind on Zoom. One messaged me privately. "Hey, I think you're right about the risk, just not my call." Not. That sentence mattered more than the public dismissal. Not my call. It was the first signal that alignment was shifting, not on logic, but on power. I documented the meeting, saved the recording, added notes to my black notebook. Date, context, language used. Not emotionally, just factually. I didn't plan to use it. I just didn't want the memory to blur. Over the next week, small things changed. Aaron began looping product managers into decisions that previously included operations from the start. I would receive updates instead of invitations. The tone remained professional, friendly even, but slightly more distant. Then came the Slack message. A product lead tagged Aaron publicly. "Do we need ops approval on this?" Aaron responded. "Not necessary at this stage." It was subtle, but language shapes hierarchy. Not necessary. For years, operational review had been embedded in the process. It wasn't optional. It was structural. Now it was being reframed as a bottleneck. Again, no one attacked me. No raised voices, no direct criticism, just repositioning. And I could feel the narrative forming, not loudly, but steadily. Leo is careful. Leo is cautious. Leo slows things down. Innovation requires speed. I could have pushed back harder in that first meeting. I could have escalated to the CEO privately. I could have insisted. But escalation over a single decision would have looked defensive, emotional, territorial. So I stayed steady. 2 weeks later, the feature launched. 4 weeks later, a client flagged a data routing inconsistency. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to require a quiet internal fix and a compliance memo drafted at 11 p.m. No public acknowledgement. No reference to the earlier warning. Aaron messaged me directly. "Appreciate you jumping on this quickly." I responded. Of course. No sarcasm, no edge. But something settled inside me that night. It wasn't anger. It was calibration. I realized this wasn't about one feature. It was about redefining where authority lived and where it didn't. And I understood something else. The first cut doesn't hurt because it's small. It hurts because it teaches people they can make another. After that Tuesday meeting, nothing exploded, which made it easier for everyone to pretend nothing had changed. The product team continued moving quickly. Leadership praised velocity. Slack channels filled with launch celebrations and animated emojis. The compliance issue faded into a quiet line item buried in a retrospective document no one outside operations read. But something had shifted, not in policy, not in title, in posture. When I spoke in meetings, responses became more streamlined, shorter, less exploratory. I wasn't challenged aggressively. I was acknowledged and then gently bypassed. Good point, Leo. Let's take that offline. We'll circle back. We rarely circled back. At first, I rationalized it. We were growing. Decision cycles were tighter. The product was driving revenue. Operations, by design, slow things down enough to prevent collapse. That role will always create tension with teams measured by speed. I understood that. I'd built my career around that balance. So I adjusted. I trimmed my comments. I chose only the highest risk issues to flag. I let smaller inefficiencies pass without correction, not because I stopped caring, but because I could feel the temperature of the room. Too many cautions, and I would reinforce the narrative forming around me. And narratives are dangerous once they solidify. What surprised me wasn't leadership. It was the team. Junior managers who used to ask for my input started prefacing messages with, "Quick question, no need to loop this wider." Wider meant me. In cross-functional docs, I noticed language shifting from ops requires to ops recommends. Subtle. But recommendations are easier to ignore than requirements. One afternoon, a new product manager introduced himself in a company-wide channel and thanked the innovation teams for the warm welcome. Operations weren't mentioned. I stared at that message longer than necessary. Not because of ego, because of pattern recognition. Disrespect rarely begins as hostility. It begins as an omission. And omission is easy to normalize. I told myself I was imagining it, that my sensitivity was shaped by that old betrayal in my 20s. Maybe I was overcorrecting. Maybe I was projecting a threat where there was simply evolution. So I stayed calm. I continued documenting. I continued delivering. I continued protecting the system quietly. But the dismissals became easier. In one executive meeting, Aaron joked, "We'll run it by Leo if legal starts breathing down our necks." The room laughed. It wasn't cruel. It was positioning. I smiled lightly, as if the joke landed on neutral ground. I didn't correct it. To object would have made me look humorless, defensive. That's how normalization works. It disguises itself as culture. Over time, I noticed something more personal. Eye contact shifted. When I raised concerns, some people looked at Aaron first, not at the data. Waiting for his reaction before forming their own. Authority had migrated. He had. And I hadn't fought for it, not because I couldn't, because I believed authority rooted in competence didn't require performance. But I began to understand something uncomfortable. Competence without narrative can be overwritten. And silence, while disciplined, can also be interpreted as surrender. Still, I didn't react. I told myself there was strength in composure. Those long games require patience. Those systems outlast personalities. But late at night, flipping through my black notebook, I noticed the entries were becoming more frequent. Dates. Language shifts. Decisions made without cross-functional review. Patterns forming. No one was attacking me directly. They were simply building a version of the company where I was less necessary. And that realization didn't spark rage. It sparked clarity. The disrespect had become normal. And what becomes normal becomes structural. There's a moment when you stop asking whether something is happening and start asking what part you've been cast in. For me, that moment wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with a confrontation or a formal announcement. It arrived during a quarterly planning session. We were mapping next year's initiatives. Big themes, expansion markets, feature acceleration, revenue targets. The whiteboard was crowded with ambition. When the conversation turned to operational capacity, the CEO glanced at me and said, almost casually, "Leo will make it work. He always does." It was meant as praise. The room nodded, comforted. And in that instant, I understood the role I had been assigned. Not a strategist, not a partner, not decision shaper. Absorber. The person who takes whatever vision is declared and bends reality quietly to accommodate it. Reliable, useful, invisible. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being reduced. There's a difference. Reduction is more elegant, less conflict. It keeps you inside the structure while narrowing your influence until you're functionally peripheral. I watched the meeting unfold with a new lens. When products defined aggressive timelines, no one asked whether they were feasible. They asked how operations would support them. When budget allocations were debated, I wasn't invited into the strategic trade-offs, only into execution logistics. I had become the safety net, and safety nets are only noticed when something falls. After the meeting, a junior manager approached me. "You're good at this," she said. "I don't know how you stay so calm when they pile things on." That word lingered. Pile. Not collaborate, not coordinate. Pile. I went back to my office and closed the door. Not in frustration, in assessment. I pulled out my notebook and reviewed the past 6 months. The language, the exclusions, the jokes, the reframing of authority. It was coherent now. They weren't trying to silence me directly. They were shaping a culture where my input was procedural, not directional. And here's the quiet truth. Part of me had allowed it. I had mistaken humility for invisibility. I had believed consistency would naturally translate into influence. I had assumed that if something mattered, logic would win. But organizations don't run purely on logic. They run on perception. And perception had shifted. The more I demonstrated resilience under pressure, the more they assumed pressure was my natural habitat. The more I absorbed risk quietly, the more they redistributed risk toward me without acknowledgement. I wasn't angry at them. I was disappointed in my own miscalculation. I had optimized for integrity. They had optimized for narrative. And in the absence of visible assertion, narrative fills the space. That afternoon, I walked through the office floor. Conversations paused slightly when I approached. Not out of fear, out of habit. People were careful not to overburden me, they said. Careful not to drag ops into early-stage creativity. It sounded protective. It was containment. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided. If they see me as infrastructure, what happens when they decide to reroute the system? The answer wasn't immediate, but the realization was, I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being positioned. And once you see the role you've been assigned, you have two choices. Accept it fully, or redefine it quietly. I didn't know yet which path I would take, but I knew something had to shift, not outwardly, internally, because the most dangerous role in any structure isn't the villain. It's the dependable man who forgets he has agency. The shift didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in the hallway, late Thursday evening. Most of the office had emptied out. The cleaning crew was already moving between desks. I was packing my bag when I saw two members of my own team standing near the glass conference rooms. They were mid-conversation. When they noticed me, their posture changed, almost imperceptibly. Shoulders straightened, voices lowered. One of them gave a small, polite nod. Hey, Leo. Too quick, too rehearsed. I walked past them, calm as always, but something in the air felt compressed. Not guilt, not hostility, fear. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask what they were discussing. I simply continued toward the elevator. But as the doors closed, I caught a reflection in the mirrored interior. My own face, composed as ever. And I realized something unsettling. They weren't uncomfortable because of me. They were uncomfortable being seen with me. That thought stayed with me through the drive home. Up until that point, everything had been about positioning at the leadership level. Narrative shifts. Authority migration. Strategic exclusion. This was different. This was social distancing. Inside the company. The next morning confirmed it. A recurring operations product sync was suddenly restructured. My team members were reassigned to report updates directly to product leads for certain initiatives. I wasn't removed from the org chart. I was bypassed in the workflow, framed as efficiency. Later that afternoon, one of my direct reports, Daniel, came into my office. He closed the door gently. His voice was careful. Just wanted to give you a heads up. There's been some guidance from above. For now, they'd prefer if cross-team communication routes through product leadership. For now, I repeated. He nodded. They said it's about alignment. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. I looked at him, not searching for betrayal, just for honesty. Are you comfortable with that? I asked. He hesitated half a second too long. I don't really have a choice. That was the moment. Not anger. Not humiliation. Clarity. This wasn't about innovation speed or cultural evolution. It was about isolation. I wasn't being debated. I was being contained. And more importantly, my team was being signaled that proximity to me carried risk. The realization landed quietly but completely. The day my team was told to stop talking to me or lose their jobs had arrived. Not as a formal decree, but as an implied consequence. No email would ever state it explicitly. But the message had traveled. I watched it in their body language, in delayed Slack responses, in meetings where eyes dropped to screens instead of meeting mine. I watched them avoid eye contact, afraid to check messages or even say hello. And in that moment I felt something unexpected. Not rage, not panic. Distance. A clean internal step back. For months, I had been reacting within their frame, trying to adjust, to rationalize, to preserve equilibrium. Standing there, I understood equilibrium was gone. They had made a move. Quiet, calculated, structural. And for the first time since this began, I stopped asking how to repair the dynamic. I started asking a different question. If I'm being isolated, what are they protecting? That question changed everything, because isolation is never random. It is always defensive. I went home that night and opened my notebook. But instead of documenting what happened, I turned to a blank page, and I wrote a single sentence at the top. If they believe I'm a liability, I need to understand why. That was the day something shifted. Not in the company, in me. There's a difference between being silenced and choosing silence. For months, my quiet had been reactive, measured, defensive. I had reduced my presence to avoid reinforcing the narrative that I was friction. But after that hallway moment, after watching my own team recalibrate their proximity to me, silence became intentional. I stopped volunteering corrections in meetings unless the risk crossed a legal threshold. I stopped filling conversational gaps. When timelines were unrealistic, I simply asked, noted, who owns the contingency if this slips? Calm, neutral, documented. And then I let the silence sit. People mistake silence for surrender because it doesn't challenge them directly. What they don't realize is that silence also creates space, and space reveals structure. Without my proactive adjustments, small inefficiencies began surfacing faster. Not catastrophes, just friction points. Deadlines quietly moved. Dependencies were misaligned. Teams asked each other questions they used to route through operations. No one called me out, but no one leaned on me the same way either. I became observant instead of corrective. It's remarkable how much information surfaces when you stop trying to fix everything. Slack channels shifted tone. Product leads began double-checking each other more frequently. Aaron's messages grew slightly more detailed, as if compensating for something unseen. Meanwhile, my team operated carefully. Professional, distant, respectful, but procedural. I didn't blame them. When authority signals risk, most people choose safety. That's human. What changed inside me wasn't bitterness. It was a recalibration. For the first time, I stopped trying to be indispensable. And that's a powerful psychological shift. When you no longer seek to prove your value, you begin to see where it truly lives. I reviewed system dependencies quietly. Vendor contracts, compliance obligations, data architecture. Cross-functional approvals are embedded in our operational structure, not to weaponize them, to understand them. Because if I were being isolated, it meant one of two things. Either I was no longer necessary, or I was necessary in a way that made someone uncomfortable. Both possibilities required clarity. In executive meetings, I adopted a new posture. I listened fully, I took notes. When asked for input, I answered concisely, no elaboration unless requested. Aaron seemed more confident without pushback. The CEO appeared relieved by the smoother discussions. Velocity increased, so did exposure. But here's what fascinated me. No one noticed I'd changed strategy. They assumed I'd accepted my reduced scope. That assumption gave me something valuable. Time. When you stop resisting visibly, people relax around you. They speak more freely. They reveal more of their thinking. They stop managing optics in your presence. One afternoon, I overheard a passing comment outside a conference room. We just need to keep Leo out of the early design loop for now. For now. That phrase again. Temporary language is often a permanent intention disguised. I wrote it down later, not with anger, but with precision. Silence allowed me to gather context without triggering countermeasures. It allowed me to see how decisions were actually being made, not how they were presented in all-hands meetings. And most importantly, it gave me emotional distance. Isolation can provoke desperation. But silence, chosen silence, restores control. I wasn't excluded anymore. I was observing. And when you observe long enough, patterns reveal leverage. I didn't know yet what I would do with that leverage. But I knew this. If they believed removing me from conversations reduced risk, they hadn't yet understood where the real dependencies were anchored in your hood. And I was no longer interested in correcting their assumptions. When people believe you've accepted your position, they stop guarding themselves around you. That's what they never noticed. My silence wasn't a retreat. It was repositioning. I didn't start digging through files like someone looking for dirt. I didn't comb through emails searching for incriminating mistakes. That would have been emotional, reactive. Instead, I returned to something far less dramatic. Infrastructure, systems, contracts, decision logs, approval chains. Operations by nature sit at the intersection of everything. Legal touches us, finance touches us, product, sales, customer success. They all route through operational checkpoints at some stage, even if they pretend not to. And because I had spent years building those checkpoints, I knew where the quiet dependencies lived. I began mapping them again. Not the official org chart, the real one. Who needed whose sign-off to release enterprise contracts? Which vendor agreements required compliance certification that only my department maintained? Which internal tools were provisioned under my administrative authority? Where regulatory exposure would surface if documentation weren't preserved correctly? Nothing illegal, nothing unethical, just reality. One afternoon, I requested updated copies of our international data processing agreements for audit readiness. No one questioned it. Audit readiness was my language. It always had been. I scheduled a routine review with finance to reconcile vendor liabilities. Standard quarterly practice. I asked IT for a permissions report, framed as part of an internal resilience assessment. All normal, all defensible. But this time, I wasn't reviewing to optimize efficiency. I was reviewing to understand structural leverage, and slowly, a picture emerged. Aaron's product acceleration strategy had outpaced certain compliance thresholds in 2 overseas markets. Not catastrophically, but enough that formal certification relied on documentation stored exclusively within operations archives. Documentation I maintained. The enterprise sales team had closed 3 large contracts with performance clauses tied to operational SLECLAs, service-level agreements that were calibrated by my department's modeling. Without updated SLA confirmations, renewal cycles would stall. Finance had quietly deferred risk disclosures based on operational forecasting models, which I personally validated each quarter. In other words, I wasn't just infrastructure, I was validated. And validation is power. Not loud power, but structural power. What they had removed me from was conversation. What they had not removed me from was dependency. That distinction mattered. Meanwhile, socially, the isolation deepened. I watched them avoid eye contact, afraid to check messages or even say hello. Not because they disliked me, because the association had been reframed as disloyalty. Daniel stopped dropping by my office. Meetings that used to include open debate became tightly scripted. When I entered a room unexpectedly, conversations paused just half a beat too long. But here's the part they didn't see. I wasn't lonely. I was calculating. Not revenge. Consequence. If I walked away tomorrow, what would actually break? Not publicly, operationally. I built a quick contingency analysis in my notebook. Column 1. Dependencies tied directly to my authority. Column 2. Dependencies tied to my knowledge but transferable. Column 3. The leadership was already decentralized. Column 3 was the most interesting. They believed certain systems were redundant. They weren't. There were single points of failure, embedded years ago during rapid growth phases, that had never been fully refactored. And I had the documentation. It wasn't sabotage to recognize this. It was stewardship. For the first time since the isolation began, I felt something steady return. Not control. Perspective. They thought they had minimized my influence by rerouting communication. What they hadn't realized was that influence doesn't always sit in meetings. Sometimes it sits in architecture, and architecture doesn't argue. It simply holds weight. The more I mapped, the clearer it became. If they wanted distance, I could give it to them, fully. But distance, in a system like ours, would reveal something they weren't prepared to see. And the realization wasn't satisfying. It was sobering, because leverage is neutral. It depends entirely on how and whether you use it. I closed my notebook one evening and understood something fundamental. The question was no longer whether I had power. The question was what kind of man I wanted to be while holding it. The discovery didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet, almost clinical. I had spent weeks mapping dependencies, reviewing contracts, and tracing operational architecture back to its original design points, not searching for mistakes, searching for truth. And the truth was this: the company wasn't insulated from me. It was anchored to me, not emotionally, structurally. The realization came late one evening while reviewing our enterprise compliance framework for international expansion. The product had celebrated entering 2 new overseas markets. Press releases had been drafted. Revenue projections adjusted upward. But the regulatory certifications supporting those expansions relied on documented operational controls that were never fully transferred outside my authority. The executive team believed they were operating independently. They weren't. Their confidence was built on validations that passed through me, even if they no longer spoke to me directly. That's when the full weight of it landed. If I withdrew cleanly, professionally, legally, ethically, several systems wouldn't collapse immediately. They would stall. Renewals would pause pending updated compliance attestations. Enterprise clients would request SLA confirmations tied to operational oversight. Audit requests would require historical documentation that only I had systematically archived and indexed. Not because I hoarded information, because I was thorough, and thoroughness had quietly accumulated into leverage. I didn't smile when I realized this. I sat back in my chair and felt something far heavier than satisfaction: responsibility. There's a dangerous temptation when you discover hidden leverage, especially after being isolated. You imagine dramatic reversals, public vindication, sudden recognition. But real power rarely announces itself. It waits. I asked myself an uncomfortable question. If they believe I'm a liability, what happens when they realize I'm a linchpin? The answer wasn't revenge. It was instability. And instability hurts more than executives. It hurts employees, clients, junior staff who never asked to be part of a political repositioning. That mattered to me. My moral code had always been simple. Never humiliate. Never retaliate emotionally. Act only when certain. I was certain now. But certainty doesn't dictate action. It clarifies options. I reviewed my employment agreement. Non-compete clauses. Notice periods. Intellectual property boundaries. Everything clean. Everything compliant. I spoke quietly with an external legal advisor under the pretext of career planning. No accusations, just scenario mapping. What would happen, I asked neutrally, if a director overseeing compliance and operational architecture exited with standard notice? The lawyer didn't speculate emotionally. He outlined process realities, transition plans, documentation handovers, regulatory disclosure timelines. Nothing dramatic, but enough. Meanwhile, inside the office, the isolation persisted. I watched them avoid eye contact, afraid to check messages or even say hello. It was almost tragic. They thought I was diminished. They didn't understand I had simply stepped back far enough to see the whole structure. One afternoon, Aaron presented a bold roadmap to the executive team. Ambitious expansion, compressed timelines, reduced operational bottlenecks. The CEO nodded approvingly. I listened without interruption. Not because I agreed, because I now understood something they didn't. Acceleration without operational certification doesn't scale. It fractures. And fractures surface during audits, not during launch parties. That evening, I opened my notebook again. On a fresh page, I wrote 2 columns. Stay, leave. Under stay, I listed potential outcomes. Continued marginalization, gradual erosion of authority, and increased risk exposure without decision-making power. Under leave, I listed realities. Controlled transition, contractual compliance, and system stress, revealing structural dependency. Neither path involved shouting. Neither involved humiliation, but only one preserved my integrity fully. The private reveal wasn't that I had leverage. It was that I no longer needed validation from people who misunderstood where value actually lived. Isolation had clarified something essential. My power was never in proximity. It was in architecture. And architecture, once removed, forces everyone to confront what they took for granted. I closed the notebook. The next step wouldn't be reactive. It would be irreversible. Clarity is heavier than confusion. When you're unsure of your position, you can still hope things will rebalance. You can tell yourself the dynamic is temporary. That perception will shift. That respect will quietly return. But when you understand the full structure, when you see the dependencies, the risk exposure, the political repositioning, hope becomes a choice. And so does departure. I gave myself 1 week. Not to cool down. I wasn't angry. To test my own motives. Every morning I asked the same question. Am I considering leaving because I'm hurt? Or because staying compromises who I am? The difference mattered. If I stayed, I would need to accept the assigned role fully. Not resent it. Do not secretly resist it. Accept being infrastructure without a voice. That requires humility, but also self-erasure. If I left impulsively, I would confirm the narrative that I was unstable under pressure. That would be emotional retaliation disguised as principle. Neither option aligned with who I wanted to be. So I considered a third path. A controlled strategic exit. One that honored my contractual obligations. Protected the company legally. Protected my team from collateral damage. And revealed, without theatrics, the truer architecture of dependency. The more I analyzed it, the clearer it became. The company believed I was peripheral. The only way to test that belief wasn't confrontation. It was an absence. But absence is irreversible. Once you resign, the relationship never returns to neutral. Trust, even strained trust, becomes transaction. I walked through scenarios carefully. If I gave extended notice and cooperated fully in transition planning, they would have time to prepare. But they didn't yet understand what preparation was required. If I left abruptly within contractual boundaries, the strain would surface faster. But it would also appear reactive. So I chose something deliberate. 30 days notice. Formal. Composed. Documented. Long enough to demonstrate professionalism. Short enough to expose assumptions. Before drafting anything, I scheduled a final private meeting with myself. No notebook, no laptop. Just honesty. Was I leaving to punish them? No. If they called me tomorrow and restored influence publicly, would I stay? That answer surprised me. No. Because the issue was no longer in authority, it was alignment. They had shown me who they believed I was, and what they valued. Velocity over stability, narrative over architecture, optics over stewardship. None of those is immoral, but they weren't mine. The irreversible choice wasn't resignation. It was refusing to compete for validation in a system that mismeasured value. That week, I watched The Office differently. Aaron moved confidently between teams. The CEO praised quarterly acceleration metrics. My team operated carefully, still avoiding visible alignment with me. I watched them avoid eye contact, afraid to check messages or even say hello, and I felt something unexpected again. Compassion. They were navigating power signals. I was navigating the principle. Those are not the same battle. On Friday afternoon, I opened a blank document. No dramatic language, no accusations, no emotional undercurrent. Just facts. Subject line. Notice of resignation. My hands were steady. The decision wasn't loud. It was final. I didn't send the resignation immediately. First, I prepared the ground, not strategically in a manipulative way, strategically in a responsible way. If I were going to leave, I would leave clean. That meant documentation. Over the next week, I consolidated operational playbooks that had lived partially in my head. I organized compliance archives into structured folders with indexed references. I annotated vendor agreements with renewal timelines and embedded risk notes. No theatrics, just stewardship. If they believed I was peripheral, then the cleanest way to test that assumption was to remove ambiguity, not create chaos. I scheduled a one-on-one with the CEO for Monday morning. Standard cadence. No hint of what was coming. In parallel, I quietly finalized external conversations I'd been having for months. Exploratory, never urgent. One opportunity had matured into something real. Smaller organization, strong governance, leadership that asked operational questions before announcing product timelines. Alignment. I didn't sign anything yet. I waited until the meeting. Monday arrived calmly. I walked into the CEO's office at 9 a.m., notebook in hand. The city skyline behind him was grey with early rain. He greeted me casually. "How are things looking on Q4 capacity?" "Stable," I said. "But that's not what I wanted to discuss." His expression shifted, not alarmed, just attentive. I placed the envelope on his desk. "I'm submitting my formal 30-day notice." Silence. Not dramatic silence, analytical silence. He didn't reach for the envelope immediately. "Is this about recent restructuring?" he asked carefully. "It's about alignment," I replied. "I believe the company is moving in a direction that doesn't require my kind of oversight at the level it once did. I don't want to become an obstacle to that." Notice what I didn't say. I didn't accuse. I didn't reference isolation. I didn't mention Aaron. I framed it as strategic divergence. He leaned back. "This is unexpected. I understand. Is there something we can adjust?" There it was. The instinct to recalibrate once the system feels potential loss. I chose my words precisely. "I've thought about this carefully. I'm committed to a clean transition. I'll prepare detailed handovers and remain fully engaged during notice. Professional, steady, unemotional." He opened the envelope then, scanning the letter quickly. "I didn't realize you were unhappy." "I'm not unhappy," I said. "I'm certain." That sentence landed differently. Unhappiness can be negotiated. Certainty cannot. The conversation remained composed. No raised voices, no bargaining. When I left the office, nothing in the hallway had changed yet. But internally, everything had. Within hours, HR scheduled a transition meeting. Aaron requested documentation of ongoing compliance workflows. Finance asked for SLA recalibration files. Requests began surfacing rapidly. Not panicked, accelerated. I responded promptly. Structured, methodical. And here's what fascinated me. For the first time in months, eye contact returned. People looked at me directly in meetings. Questions were directed to me without mediation. My presence regained gravity, not because of confrontation, but because of absence pending. Value often becomes visible only when its removal is imminent. I watched them avoid eye contact before. Now I watch them hold it, not twist it. With recalculation, I didn't enjoy it. I observed it. The real test wasn't whether they needed me. It was how they would behave when they realized they did. And that realization had only just begun. The first consequence wasn't dramatic. It was a question. 3 days after my resignation announcement, Finance emailed me requesting clarification on renewal certifications for 2 enterprise accounts expanding internationally. Normally, that request would have been routine. A quick confirmation. A standard template. Closed loop. This time, it wasn't simple. The certification framework they needed was embedded in a compliance structure that had never been fully documented outside my operational modeling. I had archived everything, but interpretation required context. "Can we transfer ownership of this to product ops?" the CFO asked in a transition meeting. I answered calmly. "The documentation exists, but the regulatory validation requires signatory oversight tied to my current role designation. That will need reassignment through legal before transfer." Silence. Not tension. Awareness. Legal asked for a timeline. "Minimum 3 weeks for formal role reclassification and jurisdictional updates," I said. My notice period was 4 weeks. That arithmetic registered. Still, no one accused, no one panicked. Yet. By the end of that week, I was invited to more meetings than I had attended in the previous 3 months combined. Suddenly, operational sequencing mattered again. Aaron scheduled a working session to ensure continuity. His tone was professional, even collaborative. "We didn't realize how many external certifications route through your office," he admitted casually. "I've flagged them in quarterly reports," I replied gently. He nodded. "Yes, we may have underestimated the concentration." Underestimated. That word held no hostility now, just recognition. Meanwhile, my team's posture shifted subtly. Daniel came by my office again, unprompted. "I didn't know you were leaving," he said. There was something like relief in his voice, or perhaps concern. "I didn't advertise it," I answered. He hesitated. "There's been a lot of conversation about dependencies." "I imagine there has." He looked at me directly this time. "They shouldn't have sidelined you." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't an apology on behalf of leadership. It was an acknowledgement. I didn't validate the grievance. "This isn't about sides," I said. "It's about structure." And the structure was now revealing itself. Product's accelerated roadmap began encountering small delays. Not because I withheld support, but because the transition required formal documentation trails they hadn't anticipated. Vendor contracts surfaced with clauses requiring operational oversight sign-offs. Audit schedules, once theoretical, suddenly carried weight because my departure required disclosure updates to regulatory bodies in 2 markets. Nothing broke, but nothing moved frictionlessly anymore. The CEO called me into his office midweek. "I need to understand something," he said evenly. "If you had stayed, would these structural risks have surfaced this quickly?" "No," I answered honestly. "Because I was absorbing them." That was the first moment the full picture landed. Absorption had masked exposure. Velocity had been subsidized by invisible stabilization. And now, without that quiet buffer guaranteed long-term, risk requires visibility. Again, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. They weren't malicious. They were optimized for speed. And speed without stabilizers feels exhilarating, until you realize how much weight those stabilizers were carrying. By the 3rd week of my notice, the company's tone had shifted. Meetings slowed. Legal presence increased. Product timelines were recalibrated with explicit operational checkpoints reinstated, not because I demanded it, but because absence demanded it. And here's what stayed with me most. I watched them avoid eye contact before, afraid to even greet me. Now I watched executives lean forward when I spoke, not out of respect for me personally, out of respect for the structure they had nearly forgotten. The consequences had begun, quietly, systemically, and there was still one more phase they hadn't anticipated, because consequences don't peak immediately. They compound. Panic doesn't arrive loudly in executive offices. It arrives as urgency disguised as collaboration. By week 4 of my notice period, the tone had shifted from structured transition to accelerated containment. Legal had flagged a regulatory notification requirement tied to my role change, something that, under normal circumstances, would have been processed quietly. But because expansion into 2 overseas markets had been announced publicly, any delay in updated compliance signatories now carried reputational exposure. The CFO scheduled a late afternoon meeting. "We need to explore retention options," he said carefully, "at least through the next audit cycle. Retention, not alignment, not a partnership. Containment." I listened without interruption. "We can adjust compensation," he continued, "reframe reporting lines, increase strategic visibility." It was a well-constructed offer. 6 months earlier, it might have worked. But by then, the dynamic had already clarified itself. "This isn't about compensation," I replied evenly. "And structural visibility after notice doesn't restore architectural trust." The CEO leaned forward. "Help me understand what would." There was no accusation in his voice, just a calculation. And that was the moment I realized something important. They weren't trying to fix the relationship. They were trying to stabilize the system, I answered honestly. What would restore alignment is a fundamental shift in how operational authority integrates into strategic planning. That isn't something you can redesign in 3 weeks. Silence. Not hostile. Final. Aaron spoke for the first time in that meeting. "We didn't anticipate the concentration of validation points in your role." I know, I said calmly. That sentence carried no edge. It was simply true. They hadn't anticipated it because stability is invisible when it works. The following days moved quickly. External auditors requested confirmation of transition protocols. Enterprise clients asked whether operational oversight changes would impact SLA guarantees. Finance delayed 2 renewal sign-offs pending updated compliance attestations. Nothing catastrophic, but enough friction to slow acceleration. The board requested a risk briefing. I prepared it professionally. No embellishment, no blame. Just structure. Where dependencies existed. What is required for reassignment? What timelines were realistic? When I finished presenting, one board member asked, "Why were these dependencies not previously highlighted?" The CEO answered before I could. They were. We underestimated their strategic weight. Underestimated. Again. But this time it wasn't about me personally. It was about architecture. After the meeting, Aaron approached me privately. "I misread you," he said quietly. I didn't respond immediately. "You weren't slowing innovation," he continued. "You were stabilizing it." "I never opposed innovation," I said. "I opposed unmodeled risk." He nodded. "I see that now." The acknowledgement was sincere, but it didn't change the timeline. My final day approached without drama. HR finalized transition documentation. Legal completed jurisdictional updates. A temporary oversight structure was installed, fragmented but functional. And here's the part that mattered most. They could fix the structure, eventually, but they couldn't fix the assumption that led to the isolation. Once you signal to someone that proximity to them is political liability, once you watch your own team avoid eye contact out of fear, you don't return to neutral. You recalibrate permanently. By the time retention offers intensified, it was too late. Not because I was angry, because I was certain. Alignment cannot be negotiated after erosion. It must be cultivated before it's tested. And they had tested it, quietly, systemically. Now they were stabilizing consequences, without me. My last formal meeting wasn't explosive. It was scheduled. Boardroom. 10 a.m. Final week. The CEO, Aaron, CFO, and head of legal. No HR this time. This wasn't administrative. It was reflective. The CEO began. "I don't want this to end as a procedural exit," he said. "I want clarity, for all of us. Clarity." That word mattered. I nodded. He continued. "Where did we miss?" There it was. Direct. No spin. I didn't rush to answer. "You didn't misstep in valuing speed," I said calmly. "You misstepped in redefining stability as obstruction." No one interrupted. When operational oversight was reframed as friction, the signal wasn't just strategic, it was cultural. Aaron held my gaze. "You're referring to the communication routing changes?" "Yes." I kept my tone even. When my team was instructed to route through product leadership to avoid unnecessary friction, it signaled that alignment with me carried risk. That changes behavior. The CFO shifted slightly. "That wasn't the intention." "I know," I replied. "But, intention doesn't override perception." Silence settled. Not defensive, just absorbing. I continued. "I watched them avoid eye contact, afraid to check messages or even say hello. Not because I'm intimidating, because proximity had been politicized." That sentence stayed in the room. Not dramatic, not accusatory. Factual. Aaron exhaled slowly. "We thought decentralizing would accelerate innovation." "It did," I acknowledged. "Temporarily. But acceleration without embedded validation concentrates risk." Legal nodded almost imperceptibly. The CEO leaned forward. "If we had reintegrated you earlier, restored strategic authority, would you have stayed?" It was a fair question. "I don't think so," I answered honestly. No one reacted sharply. Why? Because the issue wasn't authority. It was a trust architecture. They waited. When I realized influence could be reclassified without dialogue, I understood that my role existed at the discretion of narrative, not structure. That's not a stable foundation. Aaron spoke carefully. "We underestimated you." I met his eyes. "No," I said softly. "You underestimated dependency." That distinction mattered. This wasn't about ego. It was about systems. The CEO nodded slowly. "What would you advise us to do going forward?" It was the first time in months I'd been asked that without mediation. Integrate operational validation into strategic design, not as approval after the fact, but as co-architecture from inception. And never isolate stabilizers to make velocity look cleaner. You'll pay for it later. No one argued. The meeting ended without raised voices. No reconciliatory handshake. No dramatic apology. Just acknowledgement. As we stood, Aaron extended his hand and, "For what it's worth," he said, "I respect how you handled this." I shook it. "I respect that you corrected the course once you saw the structure." And that was true. They hadn't villainized me. They had optimized incorrectly. There's a difference. As I walked out of the building that afternoon, no one avoided eye contact. Several people nodded directly. The air felt lighter. Not because I'd won something, because heat had never entered the room. Confrontation without emotion is unsettling, but it's also clarifying, and clarity was all I had ever wanted. It's been 2 years. Different company, different skyline, smaller team. By design, my title changed. The pay was adjusted upward, but those aren't the meaningful differences. What changed is how I position myself. I no longer confuse quiet with invisible. At my current organization, I joined under one condition. Operational architecture would be embedded in strategic planning from day one. Not as compliance cleanup, not as a post-launch correction. Co-architecture. The first board meeting I attended here, I spoke early. Not defensively, not dominantly, clearly. We can move fast, I said. But we will model consequence in parallel. No one labeled that friction. They labeled it design. That distinction altered everything. I still keep the black notebook. Same habit, same dated entries, but the tone has shifted. The notes are collaborative now. Shared frameworks, documented risk models, and governance alignment sessions. Transparency replaces containment, and I learned something uncomfortable about myself during that previous chapter. Part of my invisibility had been self-authored. I believed integrity would automatically translate into authority. It doesn't. Authority requires articulation, not volume, not aggression. Articulation. If you don't define your value, someone else will define it for you, usually in the way most convenient to their objectives. I no longer wait to be interpreted. I define my scope clearly. I protect boundaries early. I correct reframing immediately, calmly. When someone jokes about ops slowing things down, I don't smile it away anymore. I respond evenly. Stability doesn't slow growth, it sustains it. And then I move on. No confrontation, just clarity. I also learned compassion differently. Back then, I watched them avoid eye contact, afraid to check messages or even say hello. At the time, I could have internalized that as betrayal. Now I understand it as a fear response within hierarchical systems. Most people optimize for safety. Very few optimize for principle. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them human. I don't carry resentment from that chapter, but I do carry awareness. Isolation is a signal, not always of your weakness, sometimes of your proximity to something others don't want examined. The day my team was told to stop talking to me or lose their jobs wasn't loud. There was no official memo, just subtle guidance, strategic rerouting. But the quietness of it taught me more than an open conflict would have. It taught me that power rarely announces itself, and dignity rarely requires volume. Today, when I walk into a room, I don't aim to dominate it. I aim to anchor it. There's a difference. Dominance demands attention. Anchoring earns trust. I am still calm, still observant, still precise, but I am no longer waiting to be valued. I participate in shaping how value is understood, and that is the only form of power I've ever needed. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, you probably noticed something. There was no explosion, no dramatic takedown, no public humiliation, no triumphant speech in a crowded room. And that was intentional, because the real turning point wasn't when consequences surfaced. It was when I stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided who I was. The day my team was told to stop talking to me or lose their jobs didn't break me. It clarified me. Watching them avoid eye contact, afraid to check messages or even say hello, could have made me bitter. It could have pushed me into reaction, retaliation, or emotional decision-making. Instead, it forced me to ask a harder question. Where does my value actually live? Not in proximity to power, not in titles, not in praise, in structure, in integrity, in quiet consistency. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people don't isolate you because you're weak. They isolate you because you anchor something they're trying to bypass. That doesn't mean you destroy them. It means you decide whether to continue subsidizing a system that misreads your worth. I didn't win a battle. I withdrew from a misaligned architecture. And when I did, the structure revealed itself. That's not revenge. That's physics.
If the
Silence can be weakness, but silence can also be observation. The difference is whether you're shrinking or recalibrating. And when you do act, act clean. No shouting, no sabotage, no spectacle, just clarity. Because clarity forces systems to confront themselves. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been repositioned quietly inside a room you helped build? And if so, did you fight to be seen? Or did you step back far enough to see the whole structure? I'm genuinely curious how you would have handled it.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.